Notice, all right. I guess let me backtrack because there has been obviously talks about the moral, the ethics, of course, the government being involved in this whole mandate thing, and I have been on record saying many times that if what we were discussing was a private, and this is, I've said this about, I'm consistent when it comes to private property rights. So if it doesn't matter if it's by way of discrimination, by way of race or whatever, I don't care, vaccine status, whatever it is, if the business owner require you to have to be able to physically hold a handstand for 10 seconds in order to be authorized to buy their products or go in their business or whatever, that's their right to do, right? So I've been very consistent on that, and nobody should be surprised. And that is, if you do agree or uphold private property rights is your number one thing to uphold, then yeah, that's you would agree with that. No matter how dumb it is, when it comes to accessing someone else's private property rights, they of course have the right to do it. And yes, that includes vaccines and all of that shit that you may not agree with. Some people look at it, well, they don't have the right to force you to get an injection. That's not what we're talking about. It's more at all. It's like you are wanting access to their shit, and they can require you to do whatever they want before they allow you access, and they can deny you access for that reason. However, the stipulation that I've always brought up, that's not even worth discussing, which is why I won't ever spend too much time talking about that aspect. You know why? Because that would be being disingenuous. To act like the government in any way, shape, or form, or capacity, or whatever has been removed from this equation is dishonest, and it's not worth even discussing. So we could talk about what's ideal all day long, but the state governments around the world, starting with that orange motherfucker and Operation Warp Speed, the governments around the world have influenced the situation that we have right now. It came from the government, and it's not even worth really having detailed discussions about the ethics of someone being able to do that on their own accord, or a private business or something, when that's not what we're dealing with. Private businesses that are doing this have been under the influence, be it under direct force, extortion, coercion, threatening of federal funding or funding or whatever it is. It has been facilitated by way of the state. So it's not worth living and not worth discussing more so this like that in detail like that, because that's not the world that we live in. So with that being said, here's another example of this type. There's an actual term that should be used to describe what we're dealing with right now that I'll talk about in a minute. But I want you guys to listen to this incoherent motherfucker who is the sitting president and what he had to say.
Unfortunately, while our military is stepping up, as they always do, there are others sitting on the sidelines, and we're standing in the way. If you haven't gotten vaccinated, do it.
Fuck you.
Personal choice impacts us all.
How?
Our hospitals, our countries. I make a special appeal to social media companies and media outlets. Please deal with the misinformation and disinformation that's on your shows. It has to stop. COVID-19 is one of the most formidable enemies America has ever faced.
No,
we've got to work together.
Talking about this, he said formidable enemies that this country has ever faced, and we're talking about something with a 99% survival rate.
Not against each other.
All right, so this is what's happening. This is going to escalate. I guarantee you. First of all, let's talk about what misinformation is. Misinformation is a meaningless fucking term, because all it is there is an acceptable narrative that is by the public health experts that usually are connected to the government. So you have, let's see, you have like CDC, with YouTube's misinformation policy, they more so refer to the WHO. And you have these sort of organizations, alphabet organizations that are tied to the government that take positions, and misinformation is something that goes to the contrary of what it is that they said. Okay. Now, keep in mind that these alphabet agencies have been utterly incorrect on a lot of things it is that they have said. Okay, these are the people that they're saying basically the concept of misinformation rests upon. So when Fauci goes on, talks out of both sides of his mouth regarding masks, back in February and before, when he said back in February that asymptomatic people were not generally the drivers of like a pandemic or something like that, or when Dr. Michelle Walensky flat out told a falsehood when she said, as well as the fucking CEO of Pfizer, said that this is these vaccines, people that are getting it are not getting the vaccine are not catching COVID, or rather not getting it and not getting sick. And the president, who we just listened to, has stated the same exact thing. That's misinformation, because that's not true, right? And now we know that it's not true because even they have conceded, even including Dr. Michelle Walensky, who, is the director of the CDC, has conceded exactly that point. So if we were consistent on what the idea of medical misinformation was, if we used it by more of a literal definition, all of them would have been fucking flagged. All of that shit would have been removed because they told a flat out fucking lie regarding the efficiency of the vaccinations. Which, remember, and again, do not let them forget this. Do not let them try to revise history and act like they never said that it was going to stop people from getting the virus. It was more just of a symptom mitigator. That's a fucking lie. And do not let them tell that. But the policy surrounding vaccinations and what is deemed as quote unquote medical misinformation, but more the vaccines and just all of that sort of stuff, is the government in some way, and this, when I say that it's going to escalate, we know what he's doing, and the conversation that's being had about the his mandates per se, but they'll cook up something else new that will try to maintain that these companies be forced to remove, punish people that spread what they deem as misinformation, which again is just a nonsensical, completely arbitrary term, because even if we're talking about science, the science doesn't rest upon what the fucking CDC says or the WHO, and many of them have gotten it disastrously wrong. Hell, the WHO got it wrong and admitted they got it wrong when they wrote off the whole lab leak theory early on. General Tedros came out a few months back and admitting that and saying we shouldn't have wrote that off. Yet that was one of the first things that the WHO did. So they get to conflict with themselves, and then it's the science changed when they get to do it. But God forbid some of us who have been on the right side of this the entire time, we're the ones spreading medical misinformation. All that means effectively, it doesn't mean literal medical misinformation or disinformation. What it actually means is something that goes against what the handlers say. That's it. That's all this means. Okay. But when you have him saying things and all this is basically foreshadowing to some sort of form of legislation that may be getting thrown out there and floated around by Congress, or through some executive action that's forcing these social media companies to really crack down on this sort of stuff, which is what I foresee. This is why it's not worth discussing. Going back to my original point, not worth discussing if these companies are doing this and should have the right to do it. Which again, I believe that anybody, they have the right per se to keep people from doing whatever it is they want. But what you're dealing with now is not that. You're dealing with this sort of quasi-fascism where they become the enforcement wing of the state. This would be at the social media companies or businesses like we have right now, who have mandates and all that. And sometimes it's done again by direct threat or threat that they might do something to you in the future in the event that you don't do what they want you to do. So it's coming from the top and then going down. And it's not worth even discussing this sort of world where the government is completely absolved, or rather not in the way of the conversation, because they are. When you have the fucking president saying shit like that, hey, social media companies, you need to do what I need you to do, right? It's not worth discussing, which is why I often reject those even terms, because it's not worth discussing. When we talk about that's red herring at best, and it's not a conversation worth even having, because it's not the world that we are living in right now, and we do not need to remove the government's involvement from this whole ordeal or scenario that it is that we have right now, when we know that they have been the ones that have facilitated all of what we have right now. It's like back in the Jim Crow era, or even before then, trying to discuss the state of blacks in this country, and businesses denying them access. It's not even worth discussing during that time to say, well, should a business have the right to have a sign, no blacks? Well, that's not worth discussing, because there's a law like the Louisiana Separate Boxcar Act that forces businesses to separate blacks from whites. So those laws existing on the books, so we know that this sort of racism has been endorsed and sanctioned and facilitated by the government. It's not even worth discussing it as if it's a private affair, because it's not a private affair. And that's what you're dealing with right now. And this is why I continue to say, when they act like voting rights or some shit is some voting rights, cringe along, but it's some sort of a violation, or Jim Crow 2.0. No, Jim Crow 2.0 is all of this vaccine shit, where you're trying to create this two-tiered society where it's the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated. Y'all motherfuckers are the Jim Crow 2.0.